The year is 1610. A servant girl scrubs blood from the cold stone floor of a castle chamber. Behind her, Countess Elizabeth Báthory, draped in a crimson robe, stands before a cracked mirror, rubbing blood into her skin like a holy ritual. She believes it's working. She believes she's cheating death. But is it madness? Or a macabre attempt at beauty, sanctioned by power, fear, and silence? They called her the Blood Countess. And what you're about to hear is darker than most horror stories, because it's all rooted in reality. What makes a monster? Is it something you're born with, deep in your bones, or something that grows inside you, twisted by time, trauma, and power? To understand Elizabeth Báthory, the woman history remembers as the most prolific female serial killer, we have to go back. Before the blood, before the screams, before the legend. Born in 1560 into one of the most powerful families in Hungary, Elizabeth Báthory entered a world where violence wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Her relatives were warlords, bishops, and politicians. Her uncle was rumoured to dabble in alchemy and black magic. Her cousin personally led campaigns against the Ottomans. From a young age, Elizabeth was surrounded by pain and privilege. As a child, she reportedly witnessed brutal punishments carried out on peasants. Public floggings, mutilations, even executions. These weren't considered acts of cruelty. They were tradition, justice, order. And then there was the illness. Historians believe Elizabeth may have suffered from epilepsy or intense seizures, possibly linked to inbreeding among the noble class. One common cure at the time, rubbing the blood of a non-noble onto the lips of a convulsing child. Yes, blood as medicine. Imagine being treated this way as a little girl. That wasn't the only disturbing custom. It's also reported that young noble children were given control over servants early in life, encouraged to punish them, test their will, and assert dominance. This wasn't unique to Elizabeth. This was her world. At the age of 10, she was already promised to a powerful nobleman. By 15, she was married. Her husband gifted her a castle. And in that cold stone fortress, the horrors began. But not yet. Right now, she was just a girl, wealthy, intelligent, watching, learning, and somewhere deep inside, something very, very dark was waking up. At 15, Elizabeth Báthory became Countess Elizabeth Nadasdy, married into another aristocratic powerhouse. Her husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, was known as the Black Knight of Hungary, a seasoned warrior who gained fame for his ruthless campaigns against the Ottoman Turks. He was rarely home, and when he was, he brought war with him. Their wedding was a massive political event, uniting two of Hungary's most influential families. As a wedding gift, Elizabeth received Chaktic Castle, a remote stone fortress nestled in the Carpathian Mountains. Isolated, cold, and haunting, this castle would soon become a prison for many unfortunate souls. While her husband was away fighting, Elizabeth ran the estate. She oversaw peasants, servants, and even the small army stationed at the castle. This wasn't unusual. Noble women were often expected to manage affairs in the absence of their husbands. But Elizabeth went beyond management. She ruled with an iron fist. And then, the rumors began. Stories spread of her unusual punishments. A servant girl made a mistake. Elizabeth struck her with a hairbrush until her face bled. Another spilled wine. She was locked in a freezing room overnight. Peasants whispered that the Countess had a taste for cruelty. But Ferenc didn't stop her. In fact, some say he encouraged it. When he returned from war, he allegedly taught Elizabeth his favorite battlefield tortures, how to roll oiled paper between a prisoner's toes and light it on fire, how to drive sharp needles beneath fingernails. These weren't stories made up by enemies. These were accounts later given by witnesses during her trial. And then there's Anna Darvulia, her supposed confidant and later her housekeeper. Some say she was a witch, others a midwife. But most agree. After Anna entered Elizabeth's life, the Countess's behaviour grew darker, more violent, more ritualistic. What was happening behind those castle walls? One thing is certain. Elizabeth wasn't just punishing anymore, she was experimenting, testing pain, and pushing limits no one else dared. No one knows exactly when Elizabeth Báthory crossed the line from cruelty to murder, but the whispers began long before her arrest, whispers of young servant girls who entered the castle and never came out. One story, perhaps more legend than fact, tells of a girl brushing Elizabeth's hair who accidentally tugged too hard. The Countess slapped her so violently that blood splattered across her hand. Later, Elizabeth allegedly noticed that the skin touched by the blood looked younger, smoother, fresher. To us, that sounds absurd. But in a time of plague, where medical knowledge was primitive and beauty was power, this wasn't just vanity, it was survival. If you could preserve youth, especially as a noblewoman, you preserved control, influence, marriage prospects, fertility, status. And thus began the rumors that would define her legacy. Witnesses would later claim she kept a ledger of girls, hundreds of names, many of them peasant girls lured with the promise of work. These weren't public executions or noble punishments. These were secret, hidden. The girls were locked in underground chambers, chained to walls, sometimes drained of their blood for grotesque rituals. Many scholars believe her first documented murder happened around 1609, long after years of abuse had become normalized in her household. But others argue the killings began much earlier, quiet and unnoticed, under the guise of discipline. What changed was her confidence. As her violence escalated, so did her carelessness. More bodies, more blood, more witnesses. There's evidence she began targeting daughters of minor nobility, not just peasants. That was a mistake. Nobles might turn a blind eye to peasant deaths, but not to their own. Still, the Countess didn't seem afraid. She was a woman of rank. She had money, land, and powerful allies. Who would dare accuse her of murder? And perhaps that belief, that she was untouchable, is what made her most dangerous of all. The experiments were over, the rituals had begun, and the Blood Countess was just getting started. It's the image everyone remembers. A beautiful woman stepping into a tub, brimming with blood. She closes her eyes, lets it soak into her skin, and believes she is becoming immortal. That's the legend of Elizabeth Báthory. But how much of it is true? The idea that Elizabeth bathed in the blood of virgins is perhaps the most sensational claim tied to her name. It's a gruesome, Gothic image that has captured the imagination of storytellers, historians, and horror fans for centuries. But the truth is more complicated. First, the earliest reports of blood bathing didn't appear until long after Elizabeth's death. They came from poets, dramatists, and pamphleteers, people who loved exaggeration and scandal. The real trial documents from 1611 mention bloodletting, mutilation, torture, but no literal bathing. So where did the story come from? One theory, it was symbolic. Bathing in blood may have referred to ritualistic anointing, using blood to touch the skin, as if it was some kind of dark elixir. Multiple testimonies mentioned Elizabeth rubbing blood onto her hands, face, or neck. Maybe it wasn't a full bath, but it was enough to fuel myth. Another theory is political. The more monstrous she seemed, the easier it was to justify taking her lands, her wealth, her power. Turning her into a bloodthirsty demon made her fall from grace not just acceptable, but righteous. Still, even without the bathtub, the truth remains horrific. Dozens of servants testified to seeing girls hanging upside down, their throats slit, buckets beneath them. Others spoke of iron needles, branding irons, and teeth marks. Some said she forced girls to eat their own flesh. These were not rumors. These were statements taken under oath. So whether she bathed in blood or merely spilled it doesn't change the core fact. Elizabeth Báthory was obsessed with youth, with pain, and with control. And in the dark stone halls of Countess Castle, no one was safe from her hunger. Behind the thick walls of Countess Castle, time moved differently. For the girls trapped there, days bled into nights, literally. Some begged for death, others simply disappeared. Elizabeth Báthory didn't just punish, she experimented. Witnesses described rooms stained with blood, crude wooden racks, hooks suspended from the ceiling, iron instruments whose only purpose was to inflict pain. The Countess had a sick imagination and the power to indulge it. Some victims were stripped naked and forced to stand in snow, doused with cold water until they froze to death. Others were stabbed with needles under their fingernails, whipped until their flesh fell away, or burned with red-hot metal. One servant, under oath, claimed he saw a girl's lips sewn shut with a thread made from horsehair, just for speaking out of turn. Another recounted a ritual where Elizabeth allegedly bit chunks of flesh from a girl's shoulder like a wild animal. These weren't random acts of violence. They were patterns, tests, rituals. Pain had become routine. And Elizabeth didn't work alone. She had helpers, loyal servants who enabled the cruelty or participated directly. Ilona Joe, Dorothea Sentes, Katerina Benica, and her supposed confidant, Anna Darvulia. Each played a role. Some lured girls in with promises of work, others cleaned up the bloodstains, and a few helped her torture. But even those closest to her feared her. One of her staff testified that Elizabeth once tortured a girl for hours while calmly eating dinner nearby. Another said she laughed while watching a servant crawl on broken legs, only to have them shattered further for being too slow. How could someone become so numb to suffering, or worse, find pleasure in it? Maybe Elizabeth wasn't simply a product of a brutal world. Maybe she had crossed a line so dark that even monsters feared to follow. And yet, no one stopped her. Not yet. Because as long as the victims were poor, peasant girls, she remained untouchable. But that was about to change. The silence didn't last forever. Some survived, some escaped, and some finally spoke. In 1610, after years of growing suspicion and increasing numbers of missing girls, the Hungarian authorities launched a formal investigation. What followed was one of the most disturbing collections of witness testimony in history. Over 300 depositions gathered from servants, clergy, peasants, and minor nobility. The picture they painted was nothing short of hell. One woman, a former servant, recalled seeing bodies stacked in the cellar, limbs twisted, faces unrecognizable. Another spoke of girls crawling through the halls with open wounds, crying for help, only to be dragged back into the chambers. Some girls managed to escape the castle, but many didn't make it far. Their bodies were found in nearby forests, buried in shallow graves, or not buried at all. The stench of decay was something even the villagers couldn't ignore. Then came the testimonies from Elizabeth's inner circle. Her servants, once fiercely loyal, began to turn on her, perhaps out of guilt, fear, or the promise of mercy. Ilona Joe, one of her closest aides, described how Elizabeth would select victims based on appearance, favoring fresh-faced young girls. She claimed that the Countess personally delivered fatal blows and would often laugh during torture sessions, especially if a girl screamed the right way. Another accomplice revealed that Elizabeth believed the blood of noble virgins was more powerful, purer. This shift in victim profile was critical. Once she began targeting the daughters of lesser nobility, the political shield around her began to crack. Even a priest who had once worked at the castle admitted to hearing screams echo through the stone halls during Sunday services. He never reported it. Why? Because she was a countess. But now, no rank could protect her. The evidence was overwhelming. The bodies were real, and the myth of Elizabeth Báthory as merely a misunderstood noblewoman was fading fast. What remained was a trail of corpses, and the echo of screams too long ignored. If Elizabeth Báthory had been a peasant, her story would have ended quickly, an execution, forgotten in time. But she wasn't a peasant, she was a countess, a powerful one. That made everything more complicated. The nobility protected its own. Even when rumors swirled, when peasants whispered of dozens, maybe hundreds of dead girls, Elizabeth's rank made her untouchable for years. And she knew it. She was related to some of the most powerful families in Hungary and Transylvania. Even King Matthias II owed her money, massive debts from loans she had extended to fund his wars. Would he really risk tarnishing her name and forfeiting the debt? Or could her downfall serve a political purpose? That's the dark twist of this story. As monstrous as her crimes may have been, the investigation into Elizabeth Báthory wasn't driven by justice. It was driven by politics. The man assigned to arrest her was György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, essentially the king's right hand. But Thurzó wasn't a neutral party. He was related to the Báthory family and had everything to gain by controlling their estates and shielding the monarchy from scandal. In December 1610, Thurzó made his move. He raided Chaktic Castle and claimed to catch Elizabeth in the act, surrounded by tortured girls, one of whom had just died. It was a moment of theatrical justice, but some historians believe it was staged, a carefully timed operation to trap Elizabeth, silence her, and seize her fortune. Thurzó wrote to the king that very night, "Your Majesty, I have captured the infamous Lady Báthory in her crimes, red-handed. Dramatic, convenient, political." From that moment on, Elizabeth was never free again. But here's the strange part. She was never tried, never sentenced, never even brought to court. Why? Because putting a noble woman on trial would mean exposing noble crimes. It would mean admitting that the elite were capable of horrors worse than any peasant. So instead, they buried her, not in the ground, yet, but in a tower. You might expect that after being accused of torturing and murdering over 80, some say over 600 girls, Elizabeth Báthory would have faced a grand public trial. She didn't. While her servants were dragged into courtrooms, interrogated and swiftly condemned, Elizabeth was never formally charged. There was no defense, no sentencing, no official verdict. Instead, she was quietly locked away inside her own castle tower, a symbolic punishment meant to appease the public without shaking the foundation of noble power. Why would the authorities go to such lengths to silence her without a trial? The answer is complex and deeply political. King Matthias II owed the Báthory family a large sum, some say over 17,000 gold florins. If Elizabeth were tried and executed by law, her estate would legally pass to her heirs, and the debt would still stand. But if she were declared criminal without trial, her estate could be seized by the crown or redistributed among loyal nobles. Thurzó and Matthias had everything to gain by keeping things quiet, and everything to lose if Elizabeth had a chance to speak. Because what if she named names? What if she exposed other nobles who participated in the rituals or who turned a blind eye? What if she revealed that some of the girls weren't just murdered, but delivered? Keeping her silent wasn't just about covering up her crimes. It was about protecting a system that allowed those crimes to happen. So, instead of a public trial, Thurzó convened a private hearing for the servants. Ilona Jo, Dorothea Sentes, and Katarina Benica were found guilty. Some had their fingers ripped out with iron tongs before being burned alive. Brutal, yes, but their death served as closure for the people. Meanwhile, Elizabeth remained behind stone walls, alone, untried and invisible. Her official sentence? House arrest. Her reality? A bricked-up room with a single slit for food and air, no trial, no voice. Just 4 years of silence, until her final breath. They called it house arrest, but Elizabeth Báthory's final years were more like a slow execution. Her once grand world shrank to a small windowless chamber inside Chaktica Castle's tower. According to accounts, the door was bricked shut, leaving only a narrow slit where food could be passed through. No visitors, no sunlight, no escape. She spent nearly 4 years in that tomb of stone, no trial, no confession, just silence. We can only imagine what thoughts crept through her mind during those long days and longer nights. Did she feel regret? Did she still believe in the power of blood to preserve beauty? Or did she rot in bitterness, knowing she was silenced not because she killed, but because she knew too much? According to the castle guards, her mental state deteriorated. She stopped eating, she whispered to herself. And then, on August 21st, 1614, Elizabeth Báthory was found dead in her chamber. The official cause? Unknown. Some say illness, others suggest starvation or suicide. No autopsy, no ceremony. She was 54 years old. Even in death, controversy followed her. Initially, she was buried in the church crypt in Chaktici, but locals were outraged, refusing to allow her to rest in their soil. Her remains were allegedly moved to the Báthory family estate in Exed, though even today the location of her grave remains unknown. Some say she was reburied in secret. Others claim her body was never moved at all. A woman whose legend was soaked in blood left this world as a whisper. And still, no nobleman was punished. No king repaid his debts. No inquiry ever exposed the full truth. They erased her name from records. Her portraits were hidden. Her castle, though still standing, became a symbol of horror. But you can't bury a story like Elizabeth Báthory's. Not really, because something that dark always seeps back into the light. Elizabeth Báthory died alone in a tower, but her story didn't. In fact, it was just beginning. Within a few decades of her death, the whispers started to evolve. She wasn't just a cruel noblewoman anymore, she was something supernatural. A creature who bathed in blood to preserve her youth. A woman who fed on innocence. A vampire. The transformation of Elizabeth Báthory from historical figure to Gothic legend was no accident. Her story came to life in an era obsessed with the macabre, when pamphlets, plays and ballads turned horror into entertainment. Writers in the 18th and 19th centuries especially couldn't resist her. They amplified the rumours, painted her as demonic, and added gory details never found in trial records. That she bathed daily in the blood of virgins. That she drank it from golden goblets. That she kept her victims alive for weeks to extract youth slowly. None of these details were in the original testimonies, but they didn't need to be. They felt true. And then came Dracula. Bram Stoker's 1897 novel was inspired partly by the historical Vlad the Impaler, but some scholars argue that Elizabeth Báthory's legend helped shape the seductive, bloodthirsty nature of the vampire archetype. A noble figure who draws strength from the young, beautiful, cold, immortal, and deadly. By the 20th century, she was no longer a figure of Hungarian history. She was a global horror icon. She appeared in novels, films, operas, and even heavy metal songs. Some depicted her as a literal vampire. Others leaned into feminist readings. Was she a victim of a patriarchal smear campaign? A powerful woman demonized by men? Whatever the version, one thing remained the same. Elizabeth Báthory had become myth. And unlike most serial killers or historical criminals, she didn't fade from memory. She evolved, because the idea of a woman who kills for beauty, who sacrifices youth for power, that still terrifies us and fascinates us. Why does the world remain obsessed with Elizabeth Báthory? Sure, there are many historical killers, cruel tyrants and mad royals, but few stir the imagination like she does. And it's not just the violence, it's what she represents, the intersection of beauty, power, and fear. For centuries, society has pushed a cruel double standard. Women are told that youth is power, but punished for wanting to keep it. We celebrate beauty, then shame women who chase it too hard. Elizabeth Báthory embodies this tension in the most extreme, horrifying way possible. She wasn't a poor, desperate villager. She was wealthy, educated, noble. She could read and write Latin. She managed estates. She owned castles. Yet she became infamous not for her intelligence or status, but for allegedly destroying young women to preserve herself. Her crimes, real or exaggerated, hit a nerve. A woman going too far to remain beautiful. A woman who wouldn't grow old quietly. A woman who fought back against time and used the bodies of others to do it. Modern interpretations often ask, was she a monster or a product of a misogynistic culture that worshipped her appearance but feared her autonomy? Even the bloodbath legend, so central to her myth, plays into a deeper fear. The idea that women will do anything to stay desirable, that they'll harm others, that they're vain, that they're unnatural. This narrative has echoed through centuries, in fairy tales like Snow White, in vampire films, in modern cosmetic ads. It's always there, just beneath the surface. Youth equals worth, age equals irrelevance. And Elizabeth Báthory, she's the dark mirror of that belief. She didn't just fear aging, she fought it violently. So whether or not she really bathed in blood, her legend taps into something primal, something uncomfortable, something we still wrestle with today. Because when beauty becomes a battlefield, the lines between victim and villain can blur. 400 years after her death, Elizabeth Báthory is still very much alive. In books, in films, in nightmares. You can find her in horror franchises, vampire lore, video games, and even fashion campaigns. She's been portrayed as a monster, a feminist anti-hero, a tragic figure, and an immortal icon. Everyone wants to tell her story, but no one tells it the same way. In Slovakia, where Čakotice Castle still stands, tourists walk the ruined halls with flashlights, wondering where the blood was spilled. In Hungary, her name still stirs discomfort, equal parts pride and shame. And in pop culture, she's everywhere. Movies like Stay Alive and Báthory, Countess of Blood, retell her legend with a modern twist. TV series draw on her image when depicting seductive female villains. Even bands like Cradle of Filth have dedicated albums to her myth. Her blood-soaked legacy fuels entire corners of Gothic subculture. But with every new retelling, the lines blur more. Was she a serial killer? A scapegoat? Both? Did she truly believe in blood magic? Or was that the story others needed to tell to take her down? That's what makes Elizabeth Báthory immortal. Not just the horror, but the uncertainty. She exists in a shadow world between fact and fiction. Her crimes are recorded, but her intentions remain locked in silence. And maybe that's why we can't look away. She is the ultimate Gothic icon, a noblewoman who defied gender roles, abused unchecked power, and became a symbol of both beauty and death. She is not easily categorized, she refuses to be buried. And in doing so, she's achieved the very thing she was accused of seeking: immortality. History is full of monsters, but the most haunting ones are those we almost understand. Elizabeth Báthory may or may not have bathed in blood, but the world never let her story wash away. And maybe that says more about us than it does about her. If this story shocked you, made you rethink history, or just gave you chills, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to uncover. Curious about other twisted royal secrets, bizarre rituals, or hidden horrors from history? Leave a comment below and tell us which dark tale we should dive into next.